I've never played it myself, but it looks awesome.
Dude, that's because it is awesome. Do you like customizing characters in video games? Of course you do. Check this out. When you play D&D, you got yourself a character sheet. Now here's my boy, Tazkara. It means scarred in Draconic. I drew that. That's my little guy. He's a lizard boy. He's a lizardman, but he's a fighter. Like there's different classes. So like here's some stats for him. Here's his inventory. Here's some of the abilities that he has. They're not really magical because he's a fighter. He doesn't really have any magic. But I mean, he's got swords. He's got shields. He's got currently 62 health. Like, here's a little bit about him, you know, and like he's 120 pounds, or he's 120. He's 200 pounds. He's 6'4". I made this up. I completely made this man up. He doesn't really exist as a real character. I made him up. Then you gotta go get the books. Boom. The Player's Handbook. So this book teaches you all about like the different races you could be. So this is a tiefling. And if we scroll back a little bit, you can be a half orc. Or if you scroll forward a little bit, here's some classes. So here's barbarian. So those guys are like the big hitters. You know, they use axes and, you know, not a lot of armor because they're already stupid tough. And then you get into like the bard, and they're usually, you know, a relatively sexy character who really likes to play musical instruments, whatever musical instrument you really want back in the fantasy times. And then you can go into like different details about that character. You got like sorcerer, you got druid. I played a druid. Say hello to Twig Snap. Yeah, it doesn't just have to be paper. You can make your own little figurines using websites and stuff. That's a D20. You see that 20 side on that die? That's kind of like your bread and butter die, and that's the one you're going to use the most. The player handbook also goes into like food and water, social interaction, role playing, you know, different kinds of damage, healing, you know, all sorts of stuff that you're going to need to know how to play the game. So if you're going to play, definitely get yourself a player's handbook. They have a new one now that has like a nice gold dragon on the front, some people down here. This is like an older version. But yeah, player's handbook. You're going to need that if you're going to be a player. And honestly, depending on what you want to be, you could be pretty much anything you want to be. If you just want to be a human, be a human. If you want to be a lizard man, be a lizard man. If you want to be a kanku, like I showed you, my little twig snap guy, he's a kanku. He's a crow guy. You could be a crow guy. You could be a person made out of sticks if you wanted to, and you could just make up a whole new creature. I mean, ask your DM. But Kanati, what's a DM? I'm glad you asked. A DM is known as the Dungeon Master or the Game Master, GM. I've never been one yet. I'm working on a story, and I hope within the next couple of years, after my friends have become their DM, then I can make my own story, and I can be the head of the story. You know, as a DM, you play the NPCs, you play the villains, you play, you know, the good guys, the bad guys, you play the monsters, you could play the environment. You kind of are the narrator of the story, but you also create the story. So that means you can pull your players into different paths depending on, you know, where you want to go. So when you're watching Vox Machina and you're watching Critical Role, Matt Mercer is the DM, and then obviously everybody else is a player, and they all did exactly what I just showed you. They made a character sheet, they went by the book, they always go through the book all the time. You'll see Matt, he opens up the Dungeon Master Manual or the Game Master Manual, and he flips that thing open all the time, checking for prices. He checks for, you know, how much a health potion would get you. You know, he checks for, you know, certain spells just in case. So sometimes he'll go into the player's handbook for that, depending on what it is. So he's always like the double checker. He's, you know, encouraging the players to kind of use their imagination. And well, they're all voice actors, so they all can do voices, but you don't have to do a voice. My fiance and I, we have played, well, we're almost done with our second campaign, but we've played characters. For Twig Snap, he technically couldn't talk for most of the campaign because he's a kanku. And with his lore, there's a crap ton of lore. If you're into like lore stuff, like stories and shit, definitely look up some Dungeons and Dragons stories because they are very good. They have some really cool villains and stuff like that. Speaking of villains, I'll get into that in a second, but Twig Snap didn't have a voice. I used a soundboard for crow sounds because in their lore, their god or whatever it is that they follow took their voice away, and they can only use mimicry. So they could only mimic other things. They can't actually develop a full sentence of their own voice. They also took away their creativity. They can't draw. They can't do anything. So they're basically like AI. It's hilarious. But for me, I'm a little goofball, and I like making voices. So at one point, there was a shaman goblin that was able to fix me, and I could speak.
But I put in a little voice like this because, he's a crow and he kind of has like a little gravelly, kind of noise, when he makes his noise.
But then I was able to find another Kenku who couldn't talk yet because it didn't go to the shaman. So I talked to him in my normal voice because it's a little easier to
not do this all day long.
But then it just feels less like an accent and more like I'm talking to you who understands what I'm saying. But with Tazkera, he's very gruff and angry. He's like Drax from, the Guardians of the Galaxy. He doesn't understand metaphors. He's not very smart, but he's super strong. And he doesn't get names either. He doesn't understand names. So my fiance is a red tiefling. So you saw the tiefling. They have horns and tails and stuff like that. So he just calls her Horned One or Red One because he doesn't get names. She has a name. It's Phoebe, but he doesn't get that. He doesn't understand that.
And his voice is kind of like this. So every time that he's talking, he always has this kind of voice like this. And he loves making fun of our frog friend. He's not a friend to me. He's a slaver. And we always called him Slaver because he slaved our race.
So if you want to do that, you go ahead. In your character, you want to do a voice, you go right ahead. You don't have to do a voice, though. That's the thing. Look at Sam. He barely does a voice. I mean, he kind of does his own voice, but throws a little, accent to it here and there. But it's basically just his voice. And, Marisha. There we go. Woo! Couldn't think of her name. Marisha, that's just her voice. It's her voice acting voice. It's a little, breathy and expressive. But that's just her voice. So she's not technically doing a voice. So it's like whatever. It doesn't matter. So now you're probably wondering about the monsters, the enemies. What are you going to face? Well, like in Stranger Things, as you've seen, you can face the Demogorgon, which this is what the Demogorgon looks like in D&D, which you kind of saw that in the first season. They had a little tiny statue of the Demogorgon, and this is what he looks like. Mind Flayers, so these guys are like squid guys. They're super smart. They have all these powers, and they're really, really dangerous. These guys are really hard to face. And then sometimes you have just Dungeons and Dragons named characters. Like they've made a villain, and his name is Vecna, and he's like a necromancer kind of guy, and he's like the worst dude in the world. But he's so cool looking. Look at his gold, and he's like a skeleton guy, and he has like an evil eye that can trick people, and Vecna's really cool. And in the case of Critical Role, you got dragons, and dragons come in all shapes and sizes. You got the metallic dragons, which for the most part are pretty good with humans, and then you got the chromatic dragons, like the Chroma Conclave, who don't really like humans all that much, and they're kind of the douchebags. But that's why I have a monster manual, so then I can look up all different kinds of monsters like this, which is a beholder. You don't want to find this. You do not want to find this. Thing is so tough to beat. But like I said, you got your black dragon, you got your doppelganger, you got your Dretch, and your Chasme, your intellect devourer, and even Modrones, which these are just like little clockwork creatures. And you can't forget your dice. Oh, your lovely dice. I got these for Christmas from my fiance. They got a little T-Rex skull on the inside, and you roll them. And let's see, I got a 15. That's actually not too bad. The higher the number, the better. And here's my little Tazkera figure that I was able to make with Hero Forge. Dude, you could even have dinosaurs in your game. But if you haven't found a DM yet, I really hope that you do find one. You could even do this online. They have D&D Beyond, where all the stuff I showed you is on an app. And it's so great. And I really hope you can play some D&D soon, because it is the best game I've ever played in my life.